The Texas sun beat down a relentless hammer on the parched earth. A lone rider, silhouetted against the vast, unforgiving landscape, approached a solitary, skeletal tree. Dangling from a thick branch was a small figure, a splash of white against the dusty brown. A sign, crude and stark, was pinned to her simple dress: Indian Land. This wasn't just a warning. It was a declaration of war, a spark in the tinderbox of the West. But then another figure emerged from the shimmering heat, a lone Comanche warrior. He saw not a symbol, but a child. In an act that would shatter alliances and ignite a firestorm of vengeance, he cut her down, setting in motion a chain of events that would stain the plains with blood and tears. The heat of the Texas plains in the summer of 1878 was a malevolent entity. It shimmered in waves off the cracked earth, distorting the horizon and playing tricks on the eye. It was a land that could swallow a man whole, a land that had already swallowed countless dreams. For Kai, a Comanche warrior who had seen his own world shrink with each passing year, the heat was just another layer of the silence that had become his constant companion. His people were a memory, scattered to the winds by the relentless tide of the white man. The buffalo, the lifeblood of the Numunu, were ghosts on the plains. Kai rode alone, a living relic, in a world that no longer had a place for him. His face, a mask of stoicism, was etched with the lines of loss and a weariness that went bone deep. His long black hair, once a source of pride, was now matted with dust and sweat. He was returning from a solitary hunt, 2 scrawny rabbits tied to his saddle when he saw it. A lone mesquite tree, its branches twisted and gnarled like the arthritic fingers of an old man, stood stark against the cerulean sky. From one of its sturdiest limbs, a small figure hung limp and still. Even from a distance, the splash of pale color against the muted landscape was jarring. As he drew closer, the details sharpened into a nightmare. It was a child, a white girl no older than 10. Her calico dress, once a cheerful yellow, was now a canvas of dust and grime. Her bonnet had fallen to the ground, revealing a cascade of golden hair that seemed to mock the lifelessness of her form. Pinned to her chest with a cruel-looking nail was a crudely painted sign, Indian Land. Kai's first instinct was to turn his horse to ride away and pretend he had seen nothing. This was the white man's world, their problems. He had learned the hard way that interfering in their affairs only brought more pain, more sorrow. But then a flicker of movement. The girl's small hand dangling at her side twitched. He was off his horse in an instant, his weariness forgotten, replaced by a surge of something he hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. He approached the tree cautiously, his eyes scanning the surrounding plains. This was a trap. It had to be. A gruesome bait to lure in any passing Comanche. But the silence was absolute, broken only by the buzzing of flies and the creak of the rope in the hot wind. He stood beneath the girl, his heart a leaden drum in his chest. Her face was a terrifying mask of blue and purple, her eyes bulging a thin line of saliva and blood trickling from the corner of her mouth. He could see the raw, red groove the rope had carved into her tender neck. The sign was a blatant provocation, a deliberate act of incendiary hatred. It was meant to be found, to be seen to ignite the flames of conflict. With a grunt he reached up, and with the practiced ease of a man who had lived his life on the back of a horse, began to work at the knot. It was a simple hangman's knot, tied with a grim efficiency. As he struggled with the rough fibers, his mind raced. Who would do such a thing? Who would use a child as a pawn in their bloody games? The settlers in the nearby town of Redemption were a hard lot, their fear of the savages a palpable thing. But this was a different kind of evil. The knot finally gave way, and the girl's small body fell into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile bundle of bones and fading warmth. He laid her gently on the dusty ground, his fingers fumbling as he worked to loosen the noose from her neck. The rope had bitten deep, and the flesh around it was a mangled mess. He placed his ear to her chest, straining to hear a heartbeat. It was there, faint and erratic, a desperate flutter against the vast silence of the plains. He knew he had to act fast. He had seen death in many forms, had delivered it, and watched it claim his own. He knew its scent, its feel, and it was hovering close, a patient predator waiting for this small life to flicker out. From a leather pouch at his belt, he took a small, sharp knife. With the surgeon's precision of a seasoned hunter, he made a small incision in the girl's throat, just below the ligature mark. It was a desperate, brutal act, one he had seen his grandfather, a great medicine man, perform on a warrior who had been garroted by a rival tribe. A gasp, a wet, rattling sound, and then a shallow, ragged breath. The girl's chest rose, then fell. Another breath stronger this time. Kai worked tirelessly, cleaning the wound as best he could with a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt. He had no water to spare, only the bitter contents of his canteen, which he used to moisten her cracked lips. He sat back on his heels, his breath coming in ragged bursts, his hands trembling. He had saved her for now. But what had he done? He was a Comanche, a name that struck fear and hatred into the hearts of the white settlers. To be found with a white child, especially one who had been left for dead in such a provocative manner, was a death sentence. They wouldn't ask questions. They would see a savage and a victim, and their justice would be swift and brutal. He looked down at the girl. Her breathing was shallow but steady. Her eyelids fluttered but did not open. He knew he couldn't leave her here. The sun would finish what the rope had started. He couldn't take her to his own people, for they were scattered and in hiding. And he couldn't take her to Redemption. He was trapped, caught between his humanity and the harsh reality of the world he inhabited. He looked at the sign still pinned to the girl's dress. Indian land. A lie, a cruel mockery of what had been stolen from his people. And now it was a brand that could get them both killed. He made a decision. It was a foolish, reckless decision, one that went against every instinct for self-preservation he had honed over a lifetime of survival. But as he looked at the child, he saw not a white girl, but a life, a fragile flame, in the vast, encroaching darkness, and he, Kai, the last of his line, would not let it be extinguished. He carefully lifted the girl into his arms, her head lolling against his shoulder. He carried her to his horse, a pinto with a wild, intelligent eye. The horse snorted its ears, twitching, as if sensing the gravity of the situation. With a strength born of desperation, Kai mounted, settling the child in front of him. He wrapped one arm around her small, frail body, holding her close. He took one last look at the hanging tree, a grim monument to the hatred that festered in this land. Then he spurred his horse not towards the distant hazy outline of Redemption, but towards the unforgiving wilderness of the Llano Estacado, a place where a man and a child could disappear, a place where just maybe they could survive. As the sun began its slow, bloody descent, casting long, menacing shadows across the plains, Kai rode on a lone warrior, carrying a fragile hope and a terrible secret into the heart of a hostile land. He did not know the girl's name or where she came from. He only knew that their fates were now intertwined, bound together by a rope and a lie. And in the Wild West, that was more than enough to get them both killed. The town of Redemption was a misnomer. There was no redemption to be found in its dusty streets, only the harsh, unyielding reality of life on the frontier. It was a town built on a foundation of grit, greed, and a healthy dose of fear. The saloons were always full, the church was usually empty, and the law was a thin veneer over a simmering pot of desperation. The news of the hanging spread through Redemption like a prairie fire. It came in the form of a lone rider, a trapper named Jebediah Smith, who had stumbled upon the grim scene at the mesquite tree. He had seen the discarded bonnet, the scuffed earth, the severed rope. He had not seen the girl or her rescuer. But he had seen enough. He galloped into town, his horse lathered, and his eyes wide with a mixture of horror and a grim sort of excitement. He burst through the swinging doors of the Thirsty Devil Saloon, the epicenter of Redemption's social life. She's gone. The little Miller girl. They've taken her. He roared, his voice hoarse with dust and panic. The saloon, a cacophony of drunken laughter and tinny piano music, fell silent. Men turned from their whiskey, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. The saloon keeper, a portly man with a perpetually sweat-sheened brow, named Bartholomew Barty. Higgins polished a glass with a dirty rag. "What in tarnation are you blathering about?" "Jebediah," he grumbled. "The girl Eliza Miller." Strung up from a mesquite tree south of the creek, with a sign, "Indian Land." A collective gasp went through the room. The name Eliza Miller struck a chord. She was the daughter of Jeremiah Miller, a man who owned a small, struggling ranch on the outskirts of town. A quiet, God-fearing man, but one with a fierce, protective love for his only child. A man rose from a corner table. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his face weathered and grim. This was Marshal John Corbin, the law in Redemption. He was a man of few words, but his presence carried a weight that commanded respect and a little bit of fear. "Where did you see this?" Jebediah Corbin's voice was a low growl cutting through the rising murmur of the crowd. "South of the Crooked Creek, Marshal. The big mesquite, the one that was struck by lightning last spring." There was a struggle. And this... Jebediah threw Eliza's bonnet onto the bar. It was a small, pathetic thing covered in dirt and a few dark, ominous stains. The saloon erupted. Cries of savages and heathens filled the air. Men, their courage bolstered by whiskey and a mob mentality, began to shout for a posse. They were ready to ride out to exact a bloody revenge on any Indian they could find. Corbin held up a hand. "Hold on. We don't know for sure it was Indians. That sign, it's too convenient." But his voice was drowned out by the rising tide of anger. And then a new voice, filled with a raw, guttural agony, cut through the din. "My daughter. My Eliza." Jeremiah Miller stood in the doorway, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. He was a small, wiry man, his hands calloused from years of hard labor. He had been in the general store buying candy for Eliza when he heard the commotion. Now his world was crumbling around him. He staggered to the bar, his eyes fixed on the small bonnet. He picked it up, his rough fingers stroking the faded yellow fabric. A sob, a ragged, tearing sound escaped his lips. The sight of the grieving father was a lit match to the tinderbox of the crowd's anger. "We'll get them!" "Jeremiah," a man shouted. "We'll make them pay." The cry was taken up by others. An eye for an eye. "Let's ride." Corbin knew he was losing control. He was a man of the law, but he was also a realist. He knew that in the West, fear and hatred were more powerful than any badge. He also knew that a posse fueled by whiskey and vengeance was a blunt, indiscriminate instrument. It would not distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. He tried to reason with them to urge caution, but his words were lost in the storm of their fury. Jeremiah Miller. His face streaked with tears and contorted with a terrible, all-consuming grief, turned to the crowd. "He's right," he said, his voice trembling but clear. "We'll ride. But we'll ride with the marshal. We'll do this the right way. We'll find my Eliza, and we'll bring her back." His words had a sobering effect. The men, shamed by the quiet dignity of the grieving father, fell silent. They looked to Corbin, their bloodlust momentarily checked. Corbin nodded, his face grim. "All right, Jeremiah. We'll ride. But we ride at dawn. I need to gather my deputies, and we need to be smart about this. We're not going to blunder into an ambush." The crowd dispersed, a low grumble of assent, replacing their earlier shouts for blood. But the anger, the fear, the hatred, it was still there, simmering just beneath the surface. Redemption was a powder keg, and the fuse had been lit. As the men filed out of the saloon, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a man in a tailored suit, his face clean-shaven and his hands soft. This was Mr. Silas Blackwood, a land speculator from the East. He had arrived in Redemption a few months ago, with a briefcase full of cash and a silver tongue. He had been buying up land, promising the settlers a future of prosperity, a railroad that would connect their dusty little town to the rest of the world. He approached Corbin, a look of deep concern on his face. "Marshal, this is a terrible tragedy. A terrible, terrible tragedy." Corbin grunted. His eyes narrowed. He didn't trust Blackwood. The man was too slick, too polished. He was like a fox in a hen house. "If there's anything I can do to help," Marshal Blackwood continued, his voice smooth as silk, "I have a vested interest in the safety and security of this town. We can't have this savagery frightening away investors. I'll keep that in mind." "Mr. Blackwood." Corbin said, his tone dismissive. He turned and walked out of the saloon, leaving Blackwood standing alone at the bar. Blackwood watched him go, a faint, unreadable smile playing on his lips. He then turned to Barty, the saloon keeper. "A drink, my good man," he said, his voice a low purr. "And keep them coming. It seems our little town is in for a bit of a storm." Meanwhile, miles away in the deepening twilight of the Llano Estacado, Kai sat by a small, smokeless fire. The girl Eliza lay beside him, wrapped in his saddle blanket. Her breathing was still shallow, but her color had returned to a more natural, albeit pale, hue. He had found a small, hidden canyon, a place of shelter from the wind and prying eyes. He had managed to find a small seep of water, and he had used it to clean the girl's wound more thoroughly. He had also made a poultice of herbs, a remedy his mother had taught him, and applied it to the raw, angry flesh of her neck. He watched her sleep, her small face, peaceful in the flickering firelight. He felt a strange, unfamiliar emotion stir within him. It was not pity, nor was it guilt. It was a connection, a bond forged in violence and desperation. He knew that the posse from Redemption would be coming. They would be a storm of vengeance, and he was in their path. He was a lone warrior, with a sick child, against a world that wanted him dead. He looked up at the vast, star-dusted sky. The stars were the same stars that had guided his ancestors for generations, but tonight they seemed distant, cold, and indifferent. He was alone, truly alone. And yet, as he looked down at the sleeping child, he knew he was not. He had made a choice. He had chosen to save her. And now he would have to live with the consequences. He would have to protect her not just from the harshness of the land, but from the hatred of her own people. He was Kai, a Comanche warrior, and this was his new purpose, his new battle, and he would fight it to his last breath. The rising sun painted the eastern sky in hues of blood and fire, a grim omen for the day to come. In Redemption, the posse was gathering. They were a motley crew of ranchers, farmers, and drifters, united by a common purpose: vengeance. Their faces were grim, their eyes hard. They were armed with rifles, shotguns, and a righteous fury that was more dangerous than any weapon. Marshal Corbin stood before them, his horse a steady, calming presence in the midst of the nervous energy. He was flanked by his 2 deputies, a young, eager-to-prove himself kid named Billy, and a grizzled, one-eyed veteran named Hank. "All right, listen up," Corbin's voice boomed across the dusty street. "We're going to find Eliza Miller, and we're going to find the ones who did this to her. But we're going to do it my way. No wild shooting, no lynch mobs. We bring them back, and they'll face the law." Is that clear? A murmur of assent went through the crowd. They were still angry, but Corbin's authority and Jeremiah Miller's quiet plea for a lawful pursuit had tempered their bloodlust. For now. Jeremiah Miller sat on his horse a little apart from the others. He looked old and broken, a man hollowed out by grief. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, as if he could will his daughter to appear from the shimmering heat. As the posse prepared to ride out, a woman emerged from the small, whitewashed building that served as the town's doctor's office. She was Martha Evans, the wife of Dr. Elias Evans. She was a woman of quiet strength and deep compassion, a stark contrast to the harshness of the land and the men who inhabited it. She carried a small leather bag. She approached Corbin, her face etched with concern. "Marshal," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Please be careful. Don't let this turn into a massacre." Corbin tipped his hat. "I'll do my best, Martha. But fear is a powerful thing." "I know," she said, her eyes drifting to Jeremiah Miller. "That's what worries me." She handed him the bag. "This has bandages, laudanum, and some other supplies, just in case." Corbin took the bag, a flicker of gratitude in his weary eyes. "Thank you, Martha. You're a good woman." "Just a worried one," she replied. She then walked over to Jeremiah, her hand resting gently on his arm. "We'll pray for her, Jeremiah. We'll all pray for her safe return." Jeremiah nodded, unable to speak, his throat thick with unshed tears. The posse rode out, a cloud of dust in their wake. They were a grim procession, a wave of righteous anger rolling across the plains. Martha Evans watched them go, a heavy sense of foreboding settling in her heart. Meanwhile, in the hidden canyon, Kai was tending to Eliza. The girl had woken up during the night, her eyes wide with fear and confusion. She had tried to speak, but only a hoarse, painful whisper had escaped her lips. She didn't seem to recognize him as a threat, only as the one who had saved her. Kai had offered her a piece of roasted rabbit, but she had refused it. her throat too raw to swallow. He had given her water, which she had sipped gratefully. Now she was asleep again, her small body curled up in the shade of a rock outcropping. Kai knew they couldn't stay here for long. The posse would be searching, and they would be thorough. He had to keep moving to find a place where they would be truly safe. He looked at the girl, a pang of something akin to affection stirring in his chest. She was so small, so vulnerable. He felt a fierce, protective instinct towards her, an instinct he hadn't felt since his own son had been taken by the white man's sickness years ago. He knew that what he was doing was insane. He was a Comanche. She was a white girl. Their worlds were separated by a chasm of hatred and violence. And yet here they were, two lost souls in the wilderness, their lives bound together by a cruel twist of fate. He was so lost in his thoughts that he almost didn't hear it. A faint sound, a dislodged pebble from the rim of the canyon above. He was on his feet in an instant, his knife in his hand, his body tense. He peered up, his eyes scanning the rocky ledge. He saw nothing, but he knew they were there. He could feel their presence, a prickling on the back of his neck. He had been found. He looked at Eliza, still sleeping peacefully. He had to get her out of there. But how? The canyon had only one entrance, and it was surely being watched. He was trapped. Back in Redemption. Silas Blackwood was holding court in the Thirsty Devil. He was buying drinks for everyone. His voice a smooth, confident balm on the raw nerves of the townspeople. "A terrible business this is," he said, shaking his head with a practiced solemnity. "It just goes to show you, we need to bring civilization to this land. We need the railroad. We need progress. We can't live in fear of these savages." The men, their initial fury now replaced by a gnawing anxiety, nodded in agreement. Blackwood's words were a comforting promise of a better future, a future where they wouldn't have to worry about their children being snatched from their homes. Barty, the saloon keeper, leaned over the bar. "You really think that railroad is coming, Mr. Blackwood?" Blackwood smiled, a flash of white teeth in his handsome face. "I can guarantee it, my friend. And when it does, this town, this land, it will be worth a fortune." A gleam of greed appeared in Barty's eyes. He, like many others in Redemption, had sold land to Blackwood, seduced by his promises of wealth. But this Indian trouble, Barty said, his voice low. It could scare off the investors. "Exactly," Blackwood said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "That's why this situation needs to be handled, swiftly and decisively. We need to send a message that this is our land now, and we will protect it." He looked around the saloon, his eyes lingering on the faces of the men. He was a master manipulator, a puppeteer, pulling the strings of their fear and greed. He was sowing the seeds of conflict, and he was about to reap a bloody harvest. On the plains, the posse had found the hanging tree. The severed rope still dangled from the branch, a grim testament to the violence that had taken place. Corbin dismounted, his face a mask of grim determination. He examined the ground, his eyes missing nothing. He saw the signs of a struggle, the scuffed earth, the discarded bonnet. He also saw something else, a single moccasin print. It was an Indian, one of the men said, spitting on the ground. Corbin didn't answer. He was looking at the rope. The knot was a hangman's knot, but it was sloppy, almost amateurish, and the cut, it was clean, made by a sharp knife, not a clumsy hack job. His instincts were screaming at him. Something was wrong. This was too easy, too convenient. The sign, the moccasin print. It was all a little too perfect. They're heading west. Hank, his one-eyed deputy said, pointing to a set of tracks leading away from the tree. A single rider. On a pinto. Jeremiah Miller's head snapped up. A pinto. I've seen a Comanche on a pinto skulking around my land. The men murmured amongst themselves. This was it. The proof they needed. Let's ride. One of them set his hand on his rifle. Corbin hesitated. He had a bad feeling about this, a feeling he couldn't shake. But the evidence, circumstantial as it was pointing in one direction, and the pressure from the posse was mounting. All right, he said, his voice heavy. Let's go. They mounted up and followed the tracks, a wave of vengeance sweeping across the plains. They were closing in on high on the hidden canyon, and they were thirsty for blood. The storm that Silas Blackwood had predicted was about to break, and it was going to be a bloody one. The sun was a malevolent eye in the sky, beating down on the posse as they followed the tracks of the pinto. The heat was oppressive, the air thick with dust and the scent of impending violence. Marshal Corbin rode at the head of the column, his face a grim mask. The moccasin print, the pinto Jeremiah Miller's testimony, it all painted a clear picture. But it was a picture he didn't like. It was too neat, too clean. It felt staged. His instincts, honed by years of tracking and hunting men, were screaming at him. But he was a lawman, and he had to follow the evidence. And the evidence was leading them straight to a lone Comanche warrior. They found the entrance to the canyon late in the afternoon. The tracks led directly to it. The posse reined in their horses, a low murmur of anticipation rippling through the ranks. He's in there, Hank said. His one good eye narrowed. Trapped like a rat. The men began to dismount their rifles at the ready. Their blood was up. Their earlier caution replaced by a grim determination. They were on the verge of their vengeance, and they could taste it. Hold on. Corbin's voice was a sharp crack of a whip. We're not going in there like a bunch of wild animals. We don't know what we're walking into. He could have the girl in there. We go in smart, or we don't go in at all. He turned to Jeremiah Miller. Jeremiah, I want you to stay back. You're too close to this. Jeremiah started to protest, but one look at Corbin's face and he fell silent. He nodded, his face a mask of anguish. Corbin dismounted, his shotgun in his hands. Hank, Billy, you're with me. The rest of you spread out. Cover the entrance. I don't want him slipping past us, and for God's sake, no shooting unless I give the word. We want him alive, and we want the girl. The men grudgingly did as they were told. They took up positions around the canyon entrance, their rifles trained on the dark opening. Corbin, Hank, and Billy started into the canyon, their boots crunching on the loose gravel. The canyon was narrow, the rock walls rising up on either side like a stone prison. The air was still and hot, the silence unnerving. They moved slowly, cautiously, their eyes scanning every shadow, every crevice. They were halfway into the canyon when they heard it. A small, weak cry. Eliza Jeremiah's voice from the canyon entrance was a ragged whisper. Corbin cursed under his breath. He had told the man to stay back. It's the girl, one of the men shouted. The cry came again, this time a little stronger. It was coming from deeper within the canyon. He's got her, another man yelled. The fragile discipline that Corbin had managed to impose on the posse shattered. A shot rang out. Then another. The men, their fear and rage ignited by the sound of the child's cries, began to pour into the canyon, their rifles blazing. "Hold your fire, you damn fools," Corbin roared, but his voice was lost in the chaos. It was a turkey shoot. The men were firing at shadows, their bullets ricocheting off the canyon walls in a deadly symphony of lead and stone. Deeper in the canyon, Kai flattened himself against the rock wall, shielding Eliza with his body. He had tried to keep her quiet, but she had woken up disoriented and frightened and had started to cry. He knew this was the end. He was trapped with a wounded child in a narrow canyon filled with men who wanted him dead. He had his knife, but it was a pathetic weapon against a dozen rifles. He looked down at Eliza. Her eyes were wide with terror, her small body trembling. He had saved her from the rope, only to lead her into a crossfire. He had to do something. He had to get her out of there. He made a decision. It was a desperate, suicidal decision, but it was the only one he had left. He took a deep breath. "Do not shoot!" he yelled, his voice echoing through the canyon. "The child is here. She is hurt." The shooting subsided, replaced by an tense, expectant silence. "Come out with your hands up!" Comanche Corbin's voice boomed. Kai looked down at Eliza. He couldn't surrender. They would kill him on the spot. And what would happen to her? He had to show them. He had to make them see. He carefully, gently lifted Eliza into his arms. He held her in front of him, her small, frail body, a shield against the rifles of the posse. "Do not shoot!" he yelled again. "The child is hurt. She needs a doctor." He began to walk slowly, deliberately towards the mouth of the canyon. He was a lone warrior, carrying a white child, walking into a wall of guns. The men at the canyon entrance stared, their rifles still raised, their faces a mixture of confusion and disbelief. They had expected a savage, a monster. They saw a man protecting a child. Corbin stood in front of them, his shotgun held at the ready. He could see the girl, her face pale, a dirty bandage around her neck. And he could see the Comanche, his face a mask of grim determination. "Hold your fire," Corbin said, his voice low and steady. "Hold your fire." Kai continued to walk, his heart pounding in his chest. He was exposed, vulnerable. A single nervous finger on a trigger, and it would all be over. He reached the mouth of the canyon. He was face to face with the posse, with the wall of hate and fear. He stopped, his eyes meeting Corbin's. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the wind whistling through the canyon. Then a cry from the back of the posse. Eliza Jeremiah Miller pushed his way through the crowd, his face a maelstrom of emotions. He saw his daughter alive in the arms of a Comanche warrior. He stumbled forward, his arms outstretched. "My baby." Kai looked at the grieving father. He saw not an enemy, but a man in pain. He gently, carefully lowered Eliza into her father's arms. Jeremiah clutched his daughter to his chest, his body racked with sobs. He looked at Kai, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. The tension in the canyon broke. The men lowered their rifles, their faces a mixture of relief and shame. They had been ready to kill, to lynch, and they had been wrong. Corbin approached Kai, his shotgun still held loosely in his hands. "You're coming with me, Comanche," he said, his voice devoid of its earlier hostility. Kai nodded. He knew this was not over. He had saved the girl, but he was still a Comanche. And in this land, that was a crime in itself. As the posse prepared to head back to redemption with Eliza being tended to by her father, A figure watched from a high ridge overlooking the canyon. It was Silas Blackwood. He had followed the posse, keeping a safe distance. He watched as they took Kai into custody. He watched as they rode away, a strange, triumphant procession. A small, cruel smile played on his lips. Everything was going according to plan. The Comanche had been caught. The child was safe. The town of Redemption would see this as a victory, a testament to their strength and resolve. And he, Silas Blackwood, would be there to guide them to shape their fears and their greed to his own ends. The seeds of conflict had been sown, and the harvest was just beginning. The storm had broken, but a far more dangerous one was gathering on the horizon. And it was a storm of his own making. The return of the posse to Redemption was a spectacle of confused triumph. The initial reports, fueled by rumor and fear, had painted a picture of a brutal savage and a stolen child. The reality as it unfolded in the dusty main street was far more complicated. There was Eliza Miller, weak and pale, but undeniably alive, cradled in her father's arms. And there was Kai, the Comanche warrior. His hands bound his face, a stoic mask, walking with a quiet dignity that unnerved the onlookers. The crowd that had gathered ready to celebrate a victory and witness a hanging was instead left with a disquieting sense of ambiguity. Marshal Corbin, his face grim and weary, led Kai to the small, dark cell at the back of his office. He didn't like this. None of it. The convenient sign, the too perfect tracks the Comanche who saved the child he was accused of harming. It was a puzzle, and none of the pieces fit. Eliza was taken to Dr. Evans's office. Martha Evans, her face a mixture of relief and professional concern, immediately set to work. She cleaned and dressed the wound on Eliza's neck, her gentle hands a stark contrast to the brutality of the injury. "It's a miracle she's alive, Dr. Evans." A portly man with kind eyes murmured as he examined his wife's handiwork. The rope didn't sever the artery. And this, he pointed to the small, crude incision on her throat. This saved her life. It was a tracheotomy of sorts, a desperate but brilliant piece of field surgery. Jeremiah Miller, who had been hovering by the door, his face a mess of tears and grime, looked at the doctor in confusion. Surgery. But the Indian. The Indian Dr. Evans said a new respect in his voice, knew exactly what he was doing. "He saved your daughter's life, Mr. Miller. Twice." The words hung in the air, a stark contradiction to the narrative of the savage kidnapper. Meanwhile, in the Thirsty Devil, Silas Blackwood was once again holding court. He was buying drinks, his voice a smooth, confident purr. He was spinning the story, shaping it to his own narrative. "A victory for redemption," he declared, raising his glass. "We have shown that we will not tolerate this savagery. We have rescued the child, and we have the perpetrator in custody. Justice will be served." The men, their earlier confusion now being replaced by a more familiar, comfortable anger, roared in approval. They wanted a villain, a simple black and white story, and Blackwood was giving it to them. But the Indian, he didn't kill her. One man, a little more sober than the rest, ventured. Blackwood smiled, a patronizing, dismissive smile. A clever ruse, a trick to gain our sympathy. These savages are cunning gentlemen. We must not be fooled by their deceptions. He had them. He was playing them like a fiddle, stoking their fears, their prejudices. He was turning them away from the inconvenient truth and towards a more palatable lie. In his cell, Kai sat on the hard, narrow cot, his hands now unbound. The silence was a welcome respite from the noise and the hate. He knew he was in a precarious position. His fate rested in the hands of the white man's law, a law that had never been just to his people. Corbin entered the cell, a tin plate of beans and a cup of water in his hands. He placed them on the small table. Kai didn't move. "You should eat," Corbin said, his voice gruff. Kai remained silent, his eyes fixed on the stone wall. Corbin sighed. "I need to know what happened out there. The truth." Kai finally turned to him, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "The truth. Your people wouldn't know the truth if it was branded on their foreheads." Corbin bristled at the accusation, but he held his tongue. He knew deep down that the Comanche was right. "Try me," he said, his voice quiet. Kai looked at him, a long, searching look. He saw a man weary of the violence, a man struggling with his conscience. He saw perhaps a glimmer of hope. He began to speak, his voice low and steady. He told Corbin about finding the girl, about the sign, about the twitch of her hand. He told him about cutting her down, about the desperate act that had saved her life. He told him everything. Corbin listened, his face unreadable. He had been a lawman for a long time. He had heard 1,000 stories, 1,000 lies. But this felt different. It felt like the truth. "The sign," Corbin said. "Who do you think put it there?" Kai shook his head. "It was not my people. This was the work of a white man. A white man who wants to see more blood spilled between our people." The words hit Corbin like a punch to the gut. It was what he had been thinking all along. The whole thing was a setup, a provocation. But who and why? He left the cell, his mind reeling. He went to the doctor's office. Martha Evans was sitting by Eliza's bed, bathing her forehead with a cool cloth. The girl was sleeping, her breathing now, deep and regular. "How is she?" Corbin asked. "She'll live." Martha said, her voice soft. "She's strong, but she's been through a terrible ordeal. It will take time for her to heal, both in body and in spirit." Corbin looked at the raw, angry wound on the girl's neck. "The doctor said the Indian saved her life." Martha nodded. "He did. It's a strange world we live in, Marshall. The man we accuse of being a monster is the one who saved the child." Corbin felt a growing sense of unease. He was a man of the law, and the law was supposed to be about justice. But what was justice in a world where the lines between good and evil were so blurred? He went to the thirsty devil. The saloon was a cacophony of drunken celebration. Blackwood was at the center of it, a conquering hero. Corbin watched him, a cold, hard knot of suspicion forming in his gut. Blackwood had the most to gain from an Indian war. It would drive down land prices, scare off the competition. It would make him a rich man. He approached the bar, his presence casting a sudden chill over the revelry. "Blackwood," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I need a word with you." Blackwood turned, his smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "Marshall, join us for a drink? We're celebrating a victory for civilization." "I'm not in a celebrating mood," Corbin said. "I have some questions for you." The saloon went quiet. The men, their drunken haze momentarily pierced by the tension in the air, watched, their eyes darting between the marshal and the land speculator. The unraveling had begun. The simple story of savagery and vengeance was beginning to fray at the edges, revealing a more complex and far more sinister truth. And Marshal John Corbin, a man of the law in a lawless land, was about to pull on the first thread. The consequences would be a firestorm that would engulf them all. The return of the posse to redemption was a spectacle of confused triumph. The townspeople, braced for a story of savage brutality, were met with a conflicting reality. Eliza Miller weak but alive in her father's arms, and Kai the Comanche walking with a stoic dignity that unsettled the crowd. The mob's righteous fury faltered, replaced by a disquieting ambiguity. Marshal Corbin locked Kai in the small cell behind his office. The neatness of the crime, the convenient sign, the perfect tracks gnawed at him. It felt staged. His first stop was the doctor's office. Martha Evans was tending to Eliza, while her husband, Dr. Evans, examined the girl's neck. "It's a miracle she's alive," the doctor said, his voice filled with a new respect. "The rope didn't sever the artery, and this crude incision here," he pointed, "it was a makeshift tracheotomy. It saved her life." Jeremiah Miller, hollowed out by grief, stared in disbelief. "But the Indian," Dr. Evans affirmed, "is the reason your daughter is breathing right now, Mr. Miller. He saved her life. Twice." The words hung in the air, shattering the simple narrative of a savage kidnapper. Meanwhile, in the Thirsty Devil, Silas Blackwood was working to glue that narrative back together. Buying drinks for the wavering townsfolk, his voice was a smooth, confident balm on their raw nerves. "A clever ruse," he declared, spinning the story. "A trick by a cunning savage to save his own skin. We mustn't be fooled by their deceptions. Justice will be served." He was playing on their deepest prejudices, turning them away from the inconvenient truth. In his office, Corbin faced Kai through the bars of the cell. "I need to know what happened," Corbin said, his tone gruff but earnest. Kai looked at the lawman, a flicker of understanding in his weary eyes. "The truth?" he asked, his voice low. "I found her hanging. The sign was all already there. She was still alive, so I cut her down." He explained the desperate act that had allowed her to breathe. "This was not the work of my people." Kai finished, his gaze intense. "This was done by a white man who wants war." The words landed like a hammer blow, confirming every one of Corbin's suspicions. Leaving the cell, his mind raced. He needed proof. He found it in the doctor's office. Eliza was awake, sitting up in bed, while Martha Evans read to her softly. Corbin approached, his heart aching at the sight of the small, wounded girl. "Eliza," he said gently, "I need to ask you something important. The men who hurt you, can you tell me what they looked like?" Eliza's small body trembled, a tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. Her voice was a bare whisper, a devastating truth that filled the room. They were white men." Corbin leaned closer, his own breath catching in his throat. "They had beards," she continued, her voice gaining a sliver of strength as the memory surfaced. "And one of them, he had a scar on his hand." A jolt went through Corbin. He knew that scar. He had seen it 100 times on the hand of Fletcher Smith, the very trapper who had discovered the hanging and whipped the town into a frenzy. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The whispers of truth had become a roar, and Corbin knew he was no longer just investigating a crime. He was unraveling a conspiracy, and its architect was Silas Blackwood. The setting sun bled across the plains, casting long shadows that mirrored the darkness gathering in redemption. Marshal Corbin walked with grim purpose toward the thirsty devil. He knew he was walking into a lion's den, but justice for Eliza Miller demanded it. He'd already sent his deputy Billy to bring in Fletcher Smith, the trapper with the scarred hand, and Corbin suspected a heavy conscience. Before he reached the saloon, two figures stepped from the twilight, his one-eyed deputy Hank and the Comanche warrior Kai. I let him out. Hank stated, his voice a low growl. This ain't his fight. Corbin looked at Kai, seeing not a prisoner, but a man who had shown more humanity than most in this town. Just then, Jeremiah Miller appeared, his face etched with shame and gratitude. Marshal, he said, his voice thick with emotion. This man saved my daughter. I owe him a debt I can never repay. Kai gave Corbin a silent nod, a final acknowledgement between two men who understood the complex, unwritten laws of the frontier. Then, without a word, he vanished into the deepening dusk, a ghost returning to the plains. Corbin faced the thirsty devil. His resolve hardened. He pushed through the swinging doors. The saloon was eerily quiet. Silas Blackwood sat at a back table, a bottle of whiskey between him and his two hired guns. Marshal Blackwood said, his voice a silken threat. I've been expecting you. Have a drink. I'm not here for a drink. Blackwood. Corbin's voice was cold steel. I'm arresting you for the attempted murder of Eliza Miller. Blackwood chuckled, a grating, arrogant sound. You have no proof, just the babbling of a traumatized child. I have more. I have a witness with a scar on his hand. As the words hung in the air, the doors burst open. Deputy Billy stumbled in his face, ashen. Marshal, it's Fletcher, he stammered. He's dead, hanged himself in his cabin. A triumphant, cruel smile spread across Blackwood's face. He had silenced the only witness. A guilty conscience, it seems. A tragic but fitting end, he gloated, standing slowly. Now I believe this town is under new management. His hired guns drew their pistols. Corbin was outgunned and beaten. It's not over yet, Blackwood. Martha Evans stood in the doorway, her eyes blazing with righteous fury. In her hand, she held a small leather-bound book. This was my husband's journal. She announced, her voice ringing with clarity. He documented every threat, every act of intimidation you've committed. He was a man of science, Mr. Blackwood, and a meticulous record keeper. She opened it. He also wrote down your meeting with Fletcher Smith the day before the hanging. He overheard you planning to use the child to scare Jeremiah Miller off his land. Blackwood's mask of confidence shattered. That's a lie, he snarled. Is it? A new voice trembled from behind the bar. Barty the saloon keeper stepped forward, his hands tight around a double-barreled shotgun. I heard you too, Blackwood. Heard you plotting with Smith. I was a greedy fool to trust you. The tide had turned. The town's fear had finally found its focus. Desperate and cornered, Blackwood lunged for his pistol. He was too slow. A deafening blast from Barty's shotgun threw him back against the wall. He slid to the floor, a look of shock frozen on his face, leaving a bloody smear in his wake. His hired guns, stunned, dropped their pistols. It was over. The reckoning was somber. The railroad never came, and Blackwood's promises of prosperity turned to dust. But redemption found a different, truer wealth. Eliza Miller's laughter returned to the plains. Her father Jeremiah became a voice of compassion and reason. Marshal Corbin continued to keep the peace, his faith in justice bruised but unbroken. And Kai, the lone Comanche, became a whispered legend, a silent reminder of a debt owed and a quiet act of grace in a walled, unforgiving land. The story of Eliza Miller and the lone Comanche who saved her is a stark reminder that the heroes and villains of the Wild West weren't always who they seemed. It's a tale of how fear can be twisted into hatred and how one act of compassion can ignite a fire of truth in the darkest of times. We've journeyed through the dusty streets of redemption, a town on the brink of a bloody war, and witnessed the unraveling of a sinister plot. If this story of unlikely alliances and hard-won justice resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up to let us know. Share it with others who appreciate a good Western drama, and don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell. We have many more tales from the untamed frontier coming your way, and you won't want to miss a single one. Thank you for riding with us.